Well, welcome everyone to our January installment of the IPM Hour. Happy New Year to everyone. Welcome to 2021. Let's see if it winds up being any different than 2020 was. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Uh, yes, both of them. Both hands, I should say. So, our first speaker today is going to be Danesha Seth Carley. She's an associate professor of horticultural science at NC State University and co-director of the Southern IPM Center. She received a degree in biology from Earlham College. I did have to look that one up. I didn't know where that was. That's in Indiana. She got a master's degree in entomology and plant pathology from University of Tennessee. That one I know where that is, and a doctorate degree in crop science and plant pathology from NC State. She is currently the subject editor or a subject editor for the Journal of Integrated Pest Management. And today she's going to talk about her efforts in the area of pollinator health and protection. Thank you, Danesha.
Thank you for a wonderful welcome, Matt. And you said my name and my undergrad institution correctly. So you get all 10 points for today. And actually, I'm going to be talking about my area of expertise, but I'm going to be talking about it from more of an extension standpoint. And so I kind of approached it as if I were speaking with master gardeners or someone who's really interested in pollinator gardening. With that in mind, I also do research, formal research in pollinator habitat. And so if you have questions about that, we can certainly cover those after the talk. So without further ado, I will go ahead and get started. Thank you all for having me very much. Today, we're going to talk about pollinator gardening, and I'm going to touch just very briefly on how to plan, plant, and IPM your way to a successful, beautiful pollinator garden. Next slide. So how many of these animals that you see on the screen are pollinators? Normally when I'm talking about this with my classes, I actually call on students and make them answer. But since I can't do that to you guys, I'm going to say if you guessed all of them, then you would be correct. I am mostly focused on bees and bee habitat. And so most of the time today, when you hear me talk about pollinator habitat, I'm mostly talking specifically about bees. But I do like to start my conversations about pollinators by reminding people that there are more pollinators than just Apis mellifera, which is this honeybee that you see in the top left corner. Flies, as gross as you may find them, you see this green, I don't have a pointer, but you can see the green bottlenose fly here, also in white with a white background, is also a pollinator, and flies are actually the second most efficient pollinators in our pollinator ecosystems. Hoverfly over here on the yellow flower is also a fly and most commonly seen as pollinators, often in fact mistaken for bees. Lizards, bats, bumblebees, beetles, and birds can all be pollinators. And I have a picture of a butterfly. Lepidopterans make piss poor pollinators, but I'm not going to have that conversation today about the lack of pollination services provided by lepidopterans. So we'll just lump them all together. But essentially, this is what we're talking about today. Next slide. Here's another picture of a pollinator. This is a Megachile on a zinnia. Next slide. Here's a bumblebee pollinating tomato. Next slide. We have a lepidopteran, a butterfly, also doing a poor job pollinating this flower. Next slide. Now I'm just showing off. I took all these photos and I'm very proud of my photography of these pollinators, but mostly again, I'm just showing you all kinds of pollinators just to get you ready to think about pollinators. This is a hoverfly on yarrow. Next slide. And next. All right, like I said, I'm just showing off now. All right, next slide. So again, when we're talking about pollinators, the importance of pollinators, most of the time we talk about bees. Bees are incredibly important in agriculture, and I know out west, bees are very, very important, particularly in almond fields and in other orchard crops. And in fact, they travel. Bees are put onto trucks. These are honeybees put onto trucks and trucked from Florida through North and South Carolina, up to Maine and then through the Midwest and all the way out to the almond fields. Honeybees are extremely important pollinators, but our native pollinators, bumblebees, sweat bees, leafcutter bees, mining bees, are all also very, very important, especially if you like to eat, which I very much do. You often see pictures talking about how important bees are, and instead of wowing you with agricultural numbers, I just had this really pretty little slide, a balanced breakfast on the left with bees and a breakfast without bees, just to remind you that how very important bees are, specifically in agriculture. And if you like to eat, bees should be important to you as well. Next slide. Bee populations are indeed in decline. They have been for many, many years. You've probably heard a lot about honeybees specifically and colony collapse disorder. That's been less in the news lately, but oftentimes if you hear about bees, it's usually about the death of hives. And again, we're talking honeybees mostly, but our native bees have also been in decline. Why is this? Well, contributing factors include climate change, direct and indirect or misuse of chemicals, herbicides, for example, other pesticides. There are a lot of diseases and pests, if you can believe it, of bees, and these also contribute to the decline in bee populations. Click. Thank you. And then another big contributing factor is loss of feeding sites and habitats. And I highlight this because that is specifically what we're going to be talking about today. While we can each in our individual lives probably address some of the bullet points above, loss of habitat, sometimes it feels like an awfully big job if you're the only one out there trying to protect the world from climate change. But something you can do that you can even do today, starting today, is to work on adding habitat for bees and other pollinators. Next. So something I'd like to point out, we often think that cities are places that maybe might not be good for our wildlife. However, a number of researchers have demonstrated that suburbs and cities actually have more diverse pollinator communities than nearby native areas. And if you think about that, and if you look at this photograph, it really kind of makes an odd kind of sense. If you're thinking about a pasture or a field where you might see some weedy plants, maybe some blooming grasses, that might not be as good pollinator habitat because the diversity of floral resources is not as good as what we have in our urban gardens. This photograph was taken in Denver of a very beautiful garden I like to visit while I'm there. And you can see all the diversity of the plants in this garden. And that's why there are not only a diversity of bees, but also other pollinators in our urban communities. Also, of note is that urban gardens have become more popular, especially in the last couple years, especially last year, right? And pollinator gardening near these community and urban gardens increases the yield of many of those plants. And so habitat is very important. The more habitat you have, the more bees you have. The more bees you have, the more yield you have for those crops. And in fact, pollinators do fine in the city with connected habitat. I have a little star there because there are some studies that demonstrate that in very intense urban settings, there is a heat effect that you get from, cement and asphalt and lack of green space, and that can have a negative impact on bee populations. But in general, as long as there is quality connected habitat, which means in your neighborhood, in parks, in other communities that are connected, bees can do fine. Next slide. All right, so today we're going to be talking about planning your pollinator garden. And I was actually talking with one of my best friends this morning on the phone, and we were talking about how we're getting ready to plant our vegetable garden this year. And so you've poured over your gardening books, maybe all winter, starting in the fall. You have an idea of what plants you might want to use because you've been maybe eyeing that your neighbor's flowering apricot, and you have a lust for a large, lush fruit tree in your yard, and you're just itching to get out in the garden. So how do you get started planning or planting a pollinator paradise? Well, we're going to talk about that. Next slide. All right. So ideally, the best thing to do when you're starting with a pollinator garden or adding pollinator habitat to an existing green space is to make a plan. Now, I work with a number of landscape designers who are truly artists and do just an amazing job drawing their garden plans as they're moving forward, either designing a new garden or making additions to their existing garden. That doesn't work for me. I have zero artistic ability. And so I always get out all my colored pencils and a beautiful piece of paper, and then it just looks like a 3-year-old drew it. So what I like to do is pull out all my gardening books and my seed packets and kind of sort through them, sort of Scrooge McDuck style. And I think, oh, this is what I want, and I want this, and I want this. And some people, and I'm one of these people also, I'm thinking about what I want to add in my garden all season long. We recommend that sometimes if you see plants in your neighbor's yard or in existing areas that are nearby to you, make some notes, or maybe even make notes in the margins of your gardening books about which plants you see that are attracting bees. No matter how you do it, and there is no wrong way to plan a pollinator garden, you just want to have the right elements in your garden to move forward. And before I go to the next slide, I want to mention that you can get a number of design ideas off of the internet if this sort of artistic design style speaks to you. Again, I always start out this way and then just end up rolling around in my seed packets. So I don't do this, but it's a great way to get started. And the internet is an awesome resource. Next slide. This is pretty straightforward. Again, there's no wrong way to design a pollinator habitat. When you're planning your garden or adding to an existing garden, think about planning a healthy meal for your family. You want variety in terms of color and different types of plants, just like you don't want the same type of food on your plate. You want variety and color. That's supposed to mean more nutrients, right? And that's the same for our pollinators in our gardens. You want texture, and so I'll talk a little bit more about these as we go through, but specifically you might want clumping plants, you might want grasses, you might want shrubs, or you might want low growing plants. Just adding that texture also adds diversity, which will bring more diverse pollinators to your garden. Seasonality is something I'm going to touch on later, and if you learn nothing else from this talk, you will learn that seasonality is incredibly important while we're talking about planting and planning for pollinators. So seasonality almost speaks for itself, but again, I'm going to talk more about it later, so I'm not going to talk about it anymore now. And then you want to group things together, and again, I'll talk about that later. Next slide. Pollinators, like people and plants, have 3 basic needs. They need a space that they can call their own, they need food, and they need water. It doesn't get more complicated than that. So when we're talking about space, it is a little different for pollinators than it is for people, but they need a place that is safe, that's not going to get maybe tilled up or run over. And we have a lot of native bees that nest in the ground. And so one of the things we like to recommend to people is if you have the ability to allow some of your space to be rock free, or if you're a heavy mulcher, excuse me, leave areas that are mulch free so that those ground nesting bees can use that space. And if you're tired of your lawn, instead of paving over that lawn habitat, you might think about using other things to cover your green space rather than cement or gravel. Food is pretty straightforward when you're a bee or a pollinator. The only thing that those insects are looking for is pollen and nectar. That's it. So if you're planting plants that provide one or the other or both, then you're in good shape. And then something that is necessary also, if you think about it, and I never did until I started working in this area, was that bees and again, other pollinators also need water. And so you can add water as an artistic element to your garden. Here in the South, when we talk about adding water elements, I often get pushback because people hate mosquitoes. I'm sure you all hate mosquitoes out in the West too. We get a lot of mosquitoes in the South, and it feels like every year we get more and more. And so I'm not encouraging you just to leave a bucket out in the backyard, although I do that. But you can add some really artistic elements to your garden to also allow a water element for your bees. You see here, it's just, I just put a terracotta pot base with some pretty stones in it, and that will capture water. I love this plant that has captured some water, and the bees will land on that leaf and drink the water. Again, no issues with mosquitoes. And then I always love to have an excuse to drink wine. And so I take some of my wine bottles, flip them upside down, and plant them in my garden. And you'll notice that indentation in the bottom of the wine bottle will also capture water. But again, not leaving habitat for other urban pests that we don't want. Next slide. So again, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, there is no wrong way to plant a pollinator garden if you have the right elements in your garden. And so as you're planning this, whether you're new to pollinator gardening or you're an old hand at it, and you want to maybe enhance what you already have, you want to think about keeping records of when you see plants that you are enjoying in other people's yards or in other areas, and maybe even in your own. Keep records of when those plants bloom. That will help you with that seasonality element that we were talking about earlier. When also something nice is that if you're out wandering around your yard, maybe take notes of which plants you see being visited by bees and what times of day. That will help you when you're adding habitat later, or just when you're planning ahead for what you might want to add at another time. Try new plants. Don't just keep adding the same plants because your neighbor's using them or you've always just seen them at a big box store. Look at some of those catalogs, order some new plants, plant what makes you happy. If those plants are there as resources, the bees will use them no matter what the internet tells us they say. Clump plants together. We talked about this earlier. You'll notice in this picture, I have the yellow coreopsis in the back, sort of back foreground of this picture. I've got the blanket flower in the foreground. Those are a number of plants that have sort of grown together as a clump. And in the pollinator science world, we call this floral constancy. There are a number of bees, honeybees are included in this, that prefer when they're on foraging trips to forage on the same types of flowers. And so in this case, if I were a bee and I were going out and foraging on blanket flower, for example, the gaillardia here in the foreground, I would forage on the gaillardia. And even though that cone flower, that purple cone flower, echinacea, that's on the right-hand side there, or the coreopsis, the yellow in the background there, might be perfectly acceptable plants, I'm a worker bee. I'm out collecting pollen from blanket flower and nothing else. And so it makes my job easier. And Lord knows we need to make it easier on bees. It makes my job easier to gather that pollen when we're clumping flowers together. Next slide. I don't have a whole lot of time left in the talk, and so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. But again, when most of us think about bees, we tend to think about our managed bees, specifically honeybees, which are very important bees, but our native bees are also very important. And so these solitary bees, some of which you saw pictures of earlier in my talk, are also really important to provide habitat for. So you might, a wonderful project to do with a kid, and I did this with my son a number of years ago, is I just looked on the internet for some plans for a bee hotel, and we went ahead and put one up of our own. And it was a great project, and we even had a few bees nesting in our hotels last year. Again, forego the heavy mulch and definitely don't use plastic in your landscape. That will smother or kill the bees, and it will take the habitat that the bees are using for the ground for nesting, and it'll take that out of production. And then while grasses do not provide food for pollinators, they do provide a place to live. A lot of bees like to nest in the stems of hollow grasses. And so it's nice to add a little bit of texture to your garden, as well as leaving those grasses there long term, because the bees will nest in them, lay their eggs, and then the young will emerge in the spring. Next slide. So I'm less familiar with yards out west, but I'm very familiar with yards here in the South. And something I like to tell people is that they are one of our best forage areas can be our yards. And this is actually a close-up picture of my yard. And what you might notice is that I have very little grass in my yard. In fact, I probably have the least grassy yard in my entire neighborhood. As a bee protector, I think that the things that most people consider weeds in a garden are actually the best forage for bees. Steve, if you'll just click you can go all the way. Go ahead one more time. There you go. So actually that dandelion, which again, a lot of people see as a weed, I see is a wonderful pollen-rich plant that honeybees specifically, but other native bees will forage on early in the spring to feed to their young. So it's very protein rich. It's very, very good for those young developing bees. And so I usually will put off mowing my lawn when there's dandelions out there because I am feeding my bees. Clover is another excellent one. You guys have this all over the West as well. We have a lot of white clover here, also a nitrogen fixer. And so it also makes really wonderful forage for bees. So think about replacing parts of your lawn. I'm a big turf fan. Anyone who knows me knows that I actually cut my teeth on working on golf courses. But if you can reduce some of your lawn with what I call something other, in my case, I just stopped mowing some areas and allowed these weedy plants to come in, then you're automatically providing forage for those bees. Next slide. Go ahead and hit the return again. Okay, so there's a lot of text on this slide, and I don't want to read it to you, and you don't even necessarily need to read it. I wanted to have it on the screen in case people wanted to refer to it. But essentially, and I've mentioned this before, seasonality is really important. Unlike people, bees can't go to the grocery store and buy their food. So when they're out foraging, they aren't always foraging for the same things. So if we can provide early spring flowers, mid-spring flowers, summer flowers, late summer and fall flowers, then we're sure that we're giving the bees or the pollinators that we want in our garden both pollen and nectar, so protein and carbohydrates for their entire life cycle. Next slide. So I'm just wrapping up now, and specifically just wanted to remind you of a couple things when you're planting for pollinators. Remember to use a diverse variety of plants. Again, you want things that will bloom from early spring through late fall. And in many cases, that's different types of plants, right? It's rare that you have one plant that will be an early spring plant that will also be blooming in late fall. So for example, I might plant hellebores that will bloom in early spring. And then I have asters that will bloom late into the fall. And there may be some overlap, but for the most part, you have to really pay attention to what's blooming when, so that you can get those early spring, the summer, and through the fall blooms. Don't get too wrapped up in this, but it is incumbent upon me as a pollinator researcher to mention avoiding modern hybrid flowers that have really tight whorls. Dahlia is a great example. Those are not good for pollinators, particularly because they've been genetically bred to have less pollen and also less accessibility for bees. And as much as this might be not popular for some people, bees don't ride the native plants only train. If those plants have pollen and nectar, bees don't give a crap or a rat's tushy if it's a native plant. They will access that pollen and nectar and use it to survive. So don't be too tied up in native only. You might pick native plants for other reasons, lack of pests or ability to survive in your specific environment, but don't do it for the bees. Bees don't care. Next slide. And then lastly, I promised you a little bit of IPM, and since I work in IPM, here it is. Using integrated pest management to protect pollinators in your landscapes is really, really important. You're protecting not only pollinators, but you're also protecting other beneficials in your landscape as well. And so we always say, you know, if you have to use pesticides, use them judiciously. And if I had more time, I go into what does that mean? Obviously, you want to practice best management practices when you're putting out pesticides, reading the label. If you have to spray, make sure that you're spraying in the evening when the bees aren't out in order to get hit with the pesticide, right? Spray in the early morning, again, before the bees are out and flying. And if you can, avoid the flowers. If you're spraying flowers, bees are likely to come in contact with those pesticides. Reduce mowing. We talked a little bit about that. If you can stand it, let some of those dandelions, clover, or any flowering weed come up in your garden or yard. The bees will thank you. And also, there are a number of herbs that you can plant as companion plants in your garden that deter pests, but also act as larval habitat for caterpillars. Next slide. All right. When I give this talk, I usually have a 40 or 45-minute spot, and I go through a whole long list of my very favorite pollinator plants. For today, I know that I'm limited to 20 minutes, which I'm creeping up into, and I'm running out of time, which I knew would be the case. So I'm limiting my favorite plants to these 5. You can take quick notes or you can come back to these, but these flowers I've selected for ease of growth, quality of pollen and or nectar, and also accessibility. I also think all of these plants are probably native to your area, and I know a lot of people prefer that. So those are my 5 very favorites. Next. Go ahead and run through these, Steve. Essentially, no matter what you have to work with and what your area looks like, you also can plant plants. Keep going. 2 more. You can also plant an area that will help feed the bees. So thank you for your time, and go out and plant some flowers and feed those bees.
Thanks, Danesha. That was great. We do have a question in the chat from Cynthia. She asks, so are you not as concerned about native bees, especially the specialists, needing native plants for their pollen to feed their young?
All right, so I think that's Kevin, and that's okay. Either way, he's using his wife's computer, I think. But so that's a fine question, and I don't have a lot of time to go too far into the weeds. Haha, see what I did with that? Too far into the weeds with that. But it is important for some specialist bees to have some specific plants, okay? And for example, squash bees, aptly named, because they only feed on squash pollen. So there are bees that must have very specific plants or plants and plant families that they can feed on. But we're talking in very broad strokes here because I don't have a lot of time to go too far into detail with it. Most of the bees that you're going to see in your environment are generalists, but if you have some very favorite specialist bees, I would encourage you to research them and plant what they prefer, certainly.
Great. I do have a question also. I imagine you know the work of Doug Tallamy at University of Delaware. He's worked a lot in in garden settings, and does a lot of outreach to master gardeners and others. And what he talks a lot about is using, your garden as a place not only for pollinators but also for generating, larvae, caterpillars, other things. And what he talks a lot about is sort of this balance that you have to try and strike between your garden being this beautiful place that looks great and looks like it's, out of the cover of a magazine, and one that has got leaves that have been kind of chewed up by caterpillars or weeds in it. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk about where that balance sits for you.
That's a great question, Matt. And actually, I'm in the process of publishing a book, which will be out in, can you put the top 5 pollinator plant slide up again while I'm talking, if you don't mind? I just published a book out in March. No. We talk a little bit about that. And what I really encourage people to do is, and we do this in IPM, this is not uncommon at all. I'll put them, Kathy, I'll put those plants in the chat when I'm done talking. All right. So I'll make sure that you have access to them. We tell people to modify their expectations, Matt. Instead of expecting that you're going to have a home and garden, beautifully perfect landscape, right? Maybe aesthetically or visually. Remember, thank you, Steve. Remember that some of your azalea leaves might have little half crescent cutouts in them. And that's from leafcutter bees that are cutting them and taking them home to make their homes out of. And so I try to educate people to just modify their expectations. Now, again, one thing to be aware of is that in my neighborhood, we don't have we don't have a homeowners association. So nobody gets worked up about the length of my dandelion stalks or my clover in my yard. But there are places, of course, that have homeowner associations. And there are some very strict rules about not only where you can plant, but what you can plant. And so I always encourage people to make sure that they're in line with local laws and also to educate. Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Also to educate your neighbors when it's socially acceptable to do so, have them over for a cup of sweet tea and talk about your garden and educate them about why you might leave a bunch of leaves in an area and not mulch because of the bees. And I find that that type of education goes a long way.
Great, thanks, Danesha. I'm
Before
not
we get
actually.
in too deeply to Lucy's time, I'll ask one quick question. How appropriate would that book be for folks in the West? Is it going to be too South specific or not?
Thank you for that question. It is aimed at the South. And so when we talk very specifically about the bees and the plants, many of them are Southern specific, but a lot of the concepts, the design concepts and seasonality and how to use texture in your garden is all very appropriate. And actually and I'll wrap this up very quickly. Don't tell anybody, this is secret, but a number of the pictures from the book are actually not from the South. They're from Colorado, they're from Arizona, they're from California. And so much of the information in broad strokes is applicable to anyone, anywhere in the US.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Danesha.
My pleasure, thank you all.
All right. So next up is Lucy Lee. She is an associate in extension at the Arizona Pest Management Center, and she works in the area of public health IPM, and she's been working in this area since about 2007. She studied plant protection and entomology as an undergraduate and master's student in China, and her doctorate degree at Purdue University. And today, Lucy is going to talk about her work with Native American Indian tribes in Arizona to resolve a variety of pest management issues. Lucy, your camera, I don't think is on.
Yeah, hi, Matt. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I probably will turn off my camera so that I have a stable internet connection. So let me share my screen. Can you see my slides now, Steve? Okay. So hi, my name is Lucy. Thanks to Matt for the introduction. I hope you all have a wonderful beginning in the new year. And thank you so much for your interest in my presentation today. I'm going to talk about IPM education, honoring and empowering tribal nations and indigenous peoples. And I want to start my presentation by acknowledging all my team members and collaborators. And many thanks to sponsors for funding our program, and also special thanks to our partner tribes and the tribal collaborators for their dedication to protect the community members from pests and pesticides. So human is one important IPM component or element. The social and cultural factors in the relationship between people and the pests make education, communication, and evaluation extremely important in a successful IPM program. So in addition, pests often disproportionately affect minority populations and underserved communities. Factors such as chronic pest problems, financial constraints, and limited resources, and in some cases, language barriers, leave these groups at high risk for poor pest management outcomes and increased pesticide exposures. The IPM programs in Arizona Pest Management Center, APMC, at the University of Arizona is paying special attention to stakeholder needs and priorities. And we work extensively with the minority populations and underserved communities. So as an example, I will share with you here our experience of how the UA Public Health IPM team actively engage with tribes, and develop and cultivate the effective partnerships with tribes in Arizona. So raising public awareness and implementing routine monitoring are important strategies to prevent public health pests, especially bedbugs, vector pests such as ticks and mosquitoes, and commensal rodents. So the goal of the UA Public Health IPM program is to develop and implement priority engaged research and extension public health programs statewide. And just want to point out here, those pictures with the pests, they are the common pest concerns in Arizona tribal communities. So I coordinate the UA Public Health IPM leadership team, who serves as an executive committee to guide the development and implementation of public health IPM program. So as you can see from this wheel chart, and the team includes experts from diverse fields relevant to public health pests, vector-borne diseases, and pesticide risk reduction. And currently, we have identified and prioritized 4 program focus areas: tribal IPM education and outreach, vector control, especially integrated mosquito and tick management, implementation of IPM in public schools and public housing, and food safety. So I will mainly focusing on our tribal IPM extension program. So it is important to review our common understanding of what extension is and what we do. So in U of A, extension is problem-solving, issue-driven research that is fully integrated with engaged outreach with measured outcomes that result in changed behaviors and conditions, all conditions. So we engage with university faculty, partner organizations, and clientele and other interested stakeholders to identify problems related to pests and develop solutions through applied research and education, assess and measure impacts and changes in client behavior, and finally develop feedback and adjust the research and education. So there are 22 American Indian communities that occupy more than 30% of land in Arizona today. And over the years, in collaboration with Intertribal Council of Arizona, ITCA, and the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, ITAP, Arizona Department of Health Services, Stop Pests in Housing Program, and others, our team has provided IPM training events for tribal stakeholder groups, including housing management teams, public health, and vector control professionals. There is still a critical need to conduct IPM trainings with a variety of stakeholder groups within Arizona tribal communities. So this is a diagram of how our tribal IPM program works. So first of all, we identify our stakeholder needs and the priorities by working with our tribal stakeholders to determine their pest management or public health information needs. Then we would promote partnerships to our tribal collaborators, such as the departments and agencies of partner tribes, ITCA, ITAP, and to try to reach a broad range of community members with the similar interests. We enhance communication among our academic collaborators and solicit a team of experts to provide technical assistance to stakeholders about a wide range of topics, develop and deliver educational events with locations and topics based on tribal needs. And we will also evaluate changes in participants' awareness, knowledge, skills, and attitudes toward IPM and reduce the risk management practices in their environments. So in addition, we foster ongoing working relationships with tribal extension agents and tribal community collaborators so we can continue to build and expand our effort. And we work closely with government departments and agencies who could provide resource, funding, and information to stakeholders such as EPA, USDA, CDC, regional IPM centers, and the State Department of Health Services. So I want to acknowledge our main tribal community collaborators. They play a significant role in our tribal IPM program. As you can see from the list here, we have been engaging and working with a variety of stakeholder groups in the tribal communities. There are a long list of factors that can contribute to build and cultivate a successful and effective partnerships, from communication, collaboration, to outreach, networking, and follow through with the tribal needs and the priorities. And here are some of the key activities that we have been engaging with our partner tribes. So they include the general outreach, such as annual Earth Day celebrations, tribal conferences, and the training field days. And we always worked with professionals and experts in tribes to reach a broader audience when we receive a training request. And we also conducted field work or visits as needed, and such as we did conduct IPM inspections or audits for public schools and housing sites. So like I mentioned earlier, even though we have provided many IPM training events or workshops for a variety of tribal stakeholder groups, and there is still a critical need to conduct face-to-face IPM trainings within tribal communities. And we keep the regular communications with our tribal contacts, and we have hundreds of tribal contacts that we distribute our monthly IPM newsletters and other resources to. So an average of 8 monthly newsletters are produced every year on seasonal hot topics, and those topics are selected based on stakeholder requests and identified needs. So one of my favorite activities is the annual Earth Day celebration, which is a perfect opportunity to teach community, especially youth, about insects and IPM. So we bring live arthropods and other IPM demo to teach tribal members about insects and raise awareness about pests and IPM. Our exhibits at Earth Day are always fun, interesting, and educational for youth and kids. As you can see, we always attract lots of kids at our booth, and especially it's really amazing if you see a little kid growing from a little infant to a young child. So that's the same kids on the left corner, the same kid. So many of our APMC extension professionals attended those events, and we sure appreciate this opportunity to engage with our tribal stakeholders. And sometimes you can even see tribal royalty. So here are some of the success stories. The first will be the National IPM Training for Tribal Communities in 2019. It was a broad collaboration among tribes, ITCA, EPA, USDA, regional IPM centers, universities, and lots of organizations took lots of effort to make this event successful. So the IPM training focused on providing information on IPM philosophy, the biology, behavior, identification, and control of general household pests, including mosquitoes, bedbugs, cockroaches, rodents, kissing bugs, venomous pests, pesticide safety and use. And also, we also covered the pollinators at the training. So representatives from about 21 tribes nationwide attended this training, and the target audiences were tribal environmental directors and staff, IPM coordinators, housing management team, tribal council and admin, public health professional, tribal epidemiology, and the tribal school personnel. So here the photos are some of the pictures of our lovely speakers and presenters from tribes, ITCA, ATAP, and other partner organizations. So you may recognize some of the familiar faces here. So another success story will be the Navajo Nation IPM workshop in March 2019. So we worked with the Navajo Nation Department of Health along with ITCA, Stop Passing Housing, and other departments from Navajo Nation. So this event started from a request of a pesticide training from one of the staff at the Navajo Nation Department of Health. And it ended up as a 2-day face-to-face training event on a variety of pest-related topics, IPM, pesticide safety, and of course, pollinators were included at the training. So the conference room was full with our Navajo Nation stakeholders and community members, and about 80 participants from more than 13 Navajo Nation departments or agencies attended the workshop. So it seemed that we had reached so many agencies who would serve a majority of the community members. So participants were really interested in our hands-on activities, which was a great tool to teach our audience about bedbugs, mosquitoes, high lice, and pesticide safety. Evaluation indicated that they would go back to community and they would teach their community members using the knowledge that they had gained from our training. So many of them invited us to go back to the nation to teach more about pests and pest management. So the third one will be Total Autumn Nation Healthy Homes Workshop. We not only covered pesticide safety and health impacts of pesticide exposure, IPM, and management strategies for public health pests, but also covered molds, healthy homes, and indoor air quality, asthma triggers, and healthy cleaning practices, water septic system training, fire and injury prevention. So representatives from 8 out of 11 nation districts attended this training. So many speakers at the training were actually from the tribe and worked with their tribal departments, such as Environmental Protection Agency, Healthcare, Fire Department, and Department of Natural Resources. So this brought many interests and dialogues about how the community could improve their health and environments. So evaluation indicated our participants 100% will use IPM to improve lives and communities. So my team was also involved in the Intertribal Council of Arizona ITCA Resilience Program. It leveraged the effort from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that builds capacity to support tribal resilience and adaptation to extreme events and harmful environmental trends. So 3 of our team members taught the first emergency preparedness and the resilience workshop on public health pests in January 2020 before everything happened, to tribal community leaders from across the country. So many partner tribes actually are investing in creating the climate health adaptation and the preparedness programs. So in collaboration with Stop Pests in Housing, we also organized a couple training events, mainly targeting the tribal housing authorities or housing management teams in 2017, and over 150 housing authorities, staff and manager attended our workshops. And however, as I mentioned earlier, there is a critical need for IPM training events. So in short, our team partnered with professionals and experts within the Native American communities in Arizona, promoting IPM as a solution to reduce pest-related public health pests affecting tribal communities. So the majority of in-person events were organized and carried out on tribal lands. For example, representatives from 14 tribes in Arizona participated in 7 IPM trainings covering pest-related topics in 2019. As you can see from this map, all the blue hearts are the other ones we had been, other tribes that we had been engaged with in 2019. So we responded to the needs of tribes, tribal communities on a wide range of public health related topics, including but not limited to mosquitoes, ticks, and disease-causing pathogen risks of commensal rodents. So over 229,000 residents in tribal communities benefited from our program on about 24,600 square miles of reservation lands. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we are working with our partner organizations to help tribal communities improve capacities to respond to the current crisis. So we connected with hundreds of tribal staff to share important public health resources during the pandemic, such as our IPM newsletters on how to disinfect COVID-19 and how to safely use a face mask or personal protective equipment, PPE. To be specific, these newsletters about PPE cleaning and disinfections was sent out to over 200 Navajo Nation tribal staff, hoping to help them to battle against the virus at the beginning of the pandemic, so which was about last March. So we also successfully leveraged the funding due to our engagement with our partner tribes and collaborators. So we recently were awarded an EPA Boulder 2020 grant. So we are currently working with 3 Boulder tribes, Cocopa tribe, Paskayaki tribe, and Tohono O'odham Nation in the Arizona Sonora region to identify environmental health priorities and the training needs related to the IPM and vector-borne disease. So the lessons learned from this project will also be shared with other tribes around the Southwest region through our partner organizations. So here are the lists of some of our key outreach products in this project, mainly focusing on public health concerns in the region. We organized virtual workshops for the tribal health experts on vectors, and we recorded the related presentations and made them available for other tribes so we can reach a broader audience. During our field work or visits, we partnered with tribal healthcare staff, vet technician, animal welfare, and vector control workers on vector surveillance and disease preventing efforts, such as brown dog ticks surveillance and the mobile rabies clinic to enhance the tribal capacity building against the vectors and vector-borne disease. So this project is still ongoing, and I hope I will be able to share with you more in the near future. So as I mentioned earlier, during our educational events, we evaluated changes in participant awareness, knowledge, skills, and attitudes toward IPM and reduced risk management practices. So our stats from 2019 showed that up to 75% increase in knowledge of pests and IPM. And the tribal collaborators will use IPM information to improve lives and communities. So we improved the health and well-being of our tribal community members by increasing 100% their awareness and knowledge regarding public health pests, pesticide safety, and IPM practices in their environments. So we also engaged the new and served stakeholder communities challenged by pest issues who could benefit from IPM, such as the National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Work Group and ITAP's Tribes and Climate Change Program. So I was fortunate last year was invited to present at the 2020 National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Conference and had engaged and interacted with over 250 tribal attendees from the National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Work Group. So 100% of the post-event survey respondents from that workshop indicated that the work group members raised awareness about how climate change affects the vectors and the vector management using IPM. So all conference presentations was made available to over 2,400 registrants from across the country, representatives from over 200 tribal or indigenous nations and 30 countries. So basically that meeting was really fruitful for all of us. So this is, I would love to leave this slide as my last slide. This is just all the components of how to build a successful partnerships. And I would like to leave this one so that, you know, if any of you have any questions, concerns, comments, suggestions, so we can, you know, discuss that together. So thank you for your time. And I would like to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Danesha. Thanks, Lucy. I just wanted to remind everyone that if you don't want to ask a question out loud, you can always put it in the chat. I am monitoring the chat to see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any questions currently. I do have a question, but I'm going to wait to see if there's anybody else. I'm not seeing one. So the question I have, Lucy, is we've heard quite a bit about buffalo grass invading the lower desert in Arizona and the increased risk of fire that brings. And I'm wondering, are the tribal communities that you're talking to, do they seem to be concerned about this? Because obviously, you know, wildfires in the West have been a significant issue for us over the course of the last couple of years, especially, you know, as we've seen climate change and invasive species contribute to those factors.
Yeah, I talk with, oh, I saw Andrea's here. Andrea, would you like to talk about some of the invasive plants you have on the Cocopa tribe? Okay,
Hello.
I went to the visits and, oh yeah, go ahead, Andrea.
Some of our what? Sorry.
Some of the invasive plants on the Colorado River bank, like you guys are working with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Would you like
We
to give
have
some?
oh, sorry. We have salt cedars growing all up and down the river, and some cane phragmites that grow like 10 feet high, and arunda weeds and cane, and they're just completely taking over the banks, causing erosion. Roads collapse because they just make the ground so unstable and contaminating the river. And then also bug species are coming. The salt cedars, tamarisk beetles, those have popped up on a lake up the river.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. So yes, Matt, I think the invasive plants, not only, the grass and also other invasive, plants, it is a big concern for some of the tribal reservations, or lands. Also, working with the border tribes, there are also concerns about the smoke from south of the border, and also the pesticides, the way they deal with pesticides across the border will also cause the concerns too. Yeah.
Thanks.
Lucy, how many years were you guys setting up at Earth Day celebrations before people started expecting you and inviting you back and asking you to come do trainings? I mean, what was the time to make this all happen?
We were always very excited if we heard they wanted us back. So it's, yeah, we're definitely celebrating in our own ways, and I think Shaku there is probably laughing there too. So yeah, we did our best, and I think the best way to do would be just, yeah, Shaku's there, just to go participate in the events and do your best, and then to tell our partners you are a resource there. So every time when they have some needs and priorities, and you will be the first one they will call you. And also we built this extensive partnerships. I saw the director of ATAP, Marad was there, and Andrea's there. So this definitely takes lots of efforts and trust for all of us to work on the program and work on the projects. So, and plus years of years of relation building. So yeah, but we're really happy we are here now, and yeah, hopefully keep doing the best we can. Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. And I may celebrate after the talk.
Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions, Lucy. So thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining the IPM Hour today. I just wanted to remind everyone that next month, February, the IPM Hour will be on the 10th. I believe I have that date correct.
Right.
At noon. And you will see in the February newsletter, which comes out on the second or third, you'll see details about the speakers and some additional information about that.
I can tell you the details about the speakers already.
Outstanding.
Pam Marone will be talking about the use of biologicals in IPM programs. And then Sonjay Rios, who's a UC Cooperative Extension person down in Riverside and San Diego counties, will be talking about threats to avocados, both some diseases and some insect threats to avocados.
So there you go. If you want to see Pam Marone of Marone Biotechnologies and Sonia Rios of University
Bioadvisors.
Sorry?
Pam Marone of Chestnut Bioadvisors.
Oh, it's Chestnut Bioadvisors now?
Yes, it is.
Oh my, okay. Or Sonia Rios, who's with University of California Cooperative Extension Talk. Tune in next month at noon on the 10th of February. Thank you all again.